Hello, everyone. Today is December 17th, 2018, and we just got back. This is the bi-weekly vSphere provider, cluster
Logue,
API provider.
start the recording first.
Oh, did it not start?
I think it now. Oh no, it's showing now. Sorry,
Okay.
sorry about that.
So a lot of us were at KubeCon last week, and I thought that the first topic today is to just recap KubeCon. But before we start that, let me provide a link to the document so that anybody who is here can go ahead and can add your contact information. So I hope that is the editable version. I think it is. And if you have any other topics that you want to add, go ahead and add it. Okay. Okay. So the first topic I want to do is just recap KubeCon around just the topic of cluster API. There were a lot of people attending the two specifically cluster API sessions, the one that Chris and I did, and then the one that Robert Bailey and I'm sorry, his name slipped off the top of my head, but from Samsung did. And yeah, there were quite a bit of interest. There was also a lot of discussion around cluster API and the LTS work on the topic of upgrades. So 2019 was declared as the year that we're going to really focus on upgrades. That was part of the keynote on the last day of KubeCon. So other than that, I was able to meet with Nate and some of his colleagues from NetApp, and they're looking to use the vSphere provider. And I also met with the guy from Samsung. I'll figure out his name real quickly here, but they're thinking about they wrote the
David, I think. David, wasn't
yeah,
it?
David Watson. Yes.
Watson. Yes.
Thanks. They wrote a SSH provider, but their environment is vSphere, and they're considering using the vSphere provider, switching over to using the vSphere provider. So it looks like there's a lot of interest in the vSphere provider. I also got to meet with Hans over at Pivotal. They're starting to ramp up their open source work, and they're forming a team similar to our CNX team. And right now, I think they only have like 2 or 3 people, but they have big plans on accelerating that next year. So, does anybody else want to say anything about KubeCon, specifically around cluster API? No? Okay. Well, then why don't we just go ahead and jump right into the next agenda item. I want to move one of the agenda item up because the sessions that Chris Nova and I did, was on using cluster API for on-prem and in public cloud. And at the end of the session, we gave a link to a survey that we wanted to get some information. So why don't I go ahead and share my screen? We wanted to get an idea of what people thought about our approaches. Okay, so let me move this out the way. So this is the survey that we did. We only got 14 response, but I thought it was still interesting. So the first question we asked was, what infrastructure were people deploying on-prem, public clouds, or both? And it's encouraging to see that there's quite a lot of people who are still doing on-prem and on both. Now, we got to understand this is who the audience is. We went to VMworld and we did this survey. It would be more lab
Something happened again. Hello, can you hear us? You're stuck. Let me see if I can ping him offline. Hey, Doug, is he going to like a meeting room?
Said his computer shut down.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Goes to the machine. But yet he's still frozen there.
Okay, looks like I'm the host right now. So let me just pause the recording until Luke is back.
Okay, so let me share back my, let's go back to the survey again. Hopefully my computer doesn't shut down again. So the next question I asked was, does your organization currently or plan to deploy multiple cluster? And so the purpose of this question was to kind of figure out what are customers more interested in. Are they more interested in creating multiple clusters, or are they more interested in multi-tenant clusters? This is a question not specifically for, was not a question specifically for Cluster API. I have to admit this was a question geared towards internal project that we're working on. So the vast majority, 92, 93% said that they deploy multiple clusters or they plan to. The next question is around the topic of observability. So I worked on a previous project, vSphere Integrated Container, where we built in support. It's a container runtime that use VMs as an isolation primitive, and we created hooks to vSphere, the vSphere console, that you can actually see metrics for vSphere Integrated Container from the vSphere console. And what I wanted to see here was, were the audience more interested in the open source cloud native approach like Prometheus, or were they still interested in seeing us connecting the vSphere provider, activity on the vSphere provider in the vSphere console? And you can see right here, I think this represents one. Okay, this is not sure. There was actually nobody nobody voted for the infrastructure native connection to view all the operations that we do in Cluster API. So there was one that wanted connectivity for New Relic, and that just points to the fact that they want some kind of pluggability so that we can allow other metric systems such as Wavefront and New Relic to be able to see the activity that's going on in Cluster API. So this may inform our decision on whether we do hooks into the vSphere console or not, because there were no support, nobody voted for the vSphere console. We may have to ask this question again at something like VMworld to determine whether we should move forward with that. Okay, so the next question was, how important is the ability for admin to view all cluster created in your companies? Now, this is kind of um, around the topic of whether people want a management cluster model or they want a self-service model. So the management model, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. It's you have one management cluster that can create multiple clusters. Whereas the self-service model is what Cluster API, the original model that Cluster API was built on, which is that you can deploy from your desktop, create a cluster in your cloud infrastructure, but the admin may not actually have visibility into the clusters that you've created. And this question was kind of around that topic. And the vast majority of people say that they want the administrator to be able to view all the resources clusters created or using. So I think that's a pretty good indication that they kind of want us to move towards a management cluster model. The next question, again, this is for Cluster API, but it's actually more for an internal project. The question was, which fits better with your organization, a multi-tenant cluster or for users to create multiple clusters? So in our PKS project, I've been told that most customers are more interested in multi-clusters, creating multiple clusters. However, in another project that we have internally, and I can't mention that project, but they believe that customers will eventually want to see multi-tenant clusters. And I think right now it's kind of split evenly with multiple clusters, having a slight majority, but I think over time that may change.
I think there's an important thing here, which is that no one has actually voted for a single cluster. So there's like no one that sees this cluster API deployment model as something to deploy a single cluster, and then, which is basically negating the other model. I don't know how that was referred to, but
the self-service model.
Self-service model.
So so this leads to the next question, which is, in your own word, what is your opinion of the management cluster versus self-service model? And I've already scanned through these responses, and pretty much everybody said that they want to go with the management cluster model. It's a model that it's been around for a long, long time, for decades. And I think a lot of customers, especially our customers, really understand that model. And the self-service model, in my opinion, appeals more to the solo developer out there wanting to create a cluster, who don't have to worry about oversight by an administrator. So you guys can go ahead and review these responses if you want. And then the last topic we had was, do you have any comments or concerns with the cluster API approach? And some of these are interesting. Like this last one, as a developer of a Linux distro, I have concerns that he's basically concerned his distro may be left out. And I'm not sure why he believes that. As long as his distro conforms to a cloud image, it should work fine. Fabio, how easy is it to create an OVA using another distro?
I don't think that's the concern here. I think the concern here is more like the template for the install. Not the VM template. The VM template is fine. I mean, creating like a cloud image for any type of Linux distro is, trivial. The thing here is that when you build a provider, there is there's a template that is basically what is being run inside the deployed VM, right? So when you deploy the VM, you run a series of commands that are basically setting up the Kubernetes cluster, right? And those commands, most of the time, are distro dependent. Most of the time, you're using things like yum, DNF, apt, whatever, which means that if you're targeting a specific distro, like let's say you're targeting like Debian-based, like Ubuntu or Debian, you'll tend to use apt, or you tend to use directories that are more common in Debian installs, or maybe you're using, well, most of them use systemd now, so
Okay.
maybe you're using systemd units instead of using sys5 or upstart or whatever that is. So I think that's why this commenter is concerned about having a distro that is not being supported by most of the providers. I think that's actually a good point in trying to figure out a way to make it pluggable.
Well,
So
we have this concept of a variant in cluster API. So you can have a variant that doesn't use kubeadm. And I wish that I had put into this question that if you have concerns, can you provide a email so that, I mean, the last topic was, can you provide email for us to contact, but there's no way for me to determine who actually wrote this.
No, I think
inform them about the concept of variant.
let me give you this piece of feedback on this specifically. So when I was working on Docker machine, some years ago now, there was a problem where basically the Docker machine project had the same problem, where you had to provide some sort of plugins that were the provider for the platforms. So you had the vSphere, the Fusion, the AWS, GCE, blah, blah, blah. And then you had to provide support for specific distros. So most of the cloud provider will come, with a predetermined image that it will be used to deploy Docker on top of the cloud provider. So for example, if you had GCE, you would have a image that will run Ubuntu, and Ubuntu will run with apt install, apt get install, apt get update, blah, blah, blah. But then at some point, people wanted to support like things like Red Hat or Fedora. So I think it was the introduction of libmachine, which was a library that was basically making pluggable all the various components, where you had providers on one side and you had was that machine provider on the other side, where machine provider will basically enable support for various distros inside the library. So basically, the provider will provide the OS running and an SSH connection, and then the machine provider will connect to the SSH, perform a discovery of the distro, and then use the correct machine provider for that specific distro. So you had a machine provider for Ubuntu, a machine provider for Fedora, a machine provider for Debian, a machine provider for Photon, which was the one that I built, and so on and so forth. So that way you had a pluggable way of supporting distros that were not supported, by the provider itself. So it's basically decoupling that part as well, which we're not doing today. Today we're just providing something like a provider plugin that is doing both, basically.
Yeah. I think that for future version of these surveys, we might want to. This is a good first pass at the survey, but I can see now that we can probably break out more questions, maybe around this topic and other topics. For instance, up here, I just want to point out this other comment somebody made about the management cluster versus self-service model. He said, management's cluster seems more reliable, but it doesn't say why, why he believes that.
I think Craig has something to say. I saw him raising his hand.
Go ahead, Craig.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the flow. It was more on the previous topic around image generation. So.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, new to this, I guess it's a working group. But I've been in SIG cluster lifecycle for quite a while, and also new to VMware through the Haptio acquisition. So can you just clarify whether the current implementation of the cluster API provider for VMware is using images. Is the intention to use images or to basically converge these at runtime?
What do you mean by which image are you talking about?
So there was a question around the particular user had concerns that their distro would not be supported. And I'm guessing that's for the actual runtime state of Kubernetes itself, not a management cluster per se.
Correct. Let me answer that. So right now, what we're doing for the vSphere provider, we're basically providing the management cluster part, which is an OVA, is a pre-installed OVA, and that is not obviously part of this concern. The concern is the runtime, and the runtime right now, what is supported, what we tell people that is supported is Ubuntu-based images. So you download Ubuntu 16.04, I think, and that is supported, and the command template inside the provider will just run apt-get and a bunch of other install commands. So
Okay.
that's why I guess that's why the user is concerned about having more distro support.
So
Yeah.
just to give clarity, a lot of the discussions that we've had around cluster API from within the Heptio sphere, and there's no secrets here, this has all been done in the community, is around immutable images. And we do have a project called Boardroom that is capable of building images for a variety of providers. So basically, we, out of the box, will provide you base images for both Ubuntu, Xenial, Bionic, various flavors of CentOS and Red Hat. And then we'll basically be able to mutate those images with Kubernetes bits inside them for whatever version of Kubernetes you're using. And then basically be able to spit them out into raw images, AMIs, VMware. I don't think we have VMware support yet, but it would be probably 20 lines of code. Be happy to add that in.
Is this the Amper project that I've heard mentioned before?
It's a Heptio project. So now it's a VMware project, I guess.
There's a lot of different ways to skin that particular cat. I've been involved in a lot of these efforts in the past in various capacities. Like Packer was probably the most well-known project that's basically doing this. There's Linux Kit. There's a bunch of other projects that are basically aiming towards the same goal, which is creating immutable images from a definition.
Right. So this is actually it just uses Packer under the covers, but the pieces of Boardroom are just orchestrating both Ansible and Packer to generate the images, which may be of use to this particular use case. I having done this for a long time myself, I find that converging OSs at runtime, whether you don't, it could be things like you're in an air-gapped facility, you don't have access to the internet, is just a much more reliable way to go about things.
Let me just say that I 100% agree with you, 110% agree with you. That's definitely the way to go. I don't think we're there yet in our implementation specifically, but it's definitely where I wanted this to be going. I guess that the difficult part is to standardize on a way that can be common across all the providers, which would provide a better experience for the end user at the end. Getting to that point is probably the most difficult part. Most of the time it's not the technology the problem. The problem is making all the people converge to the same idea or the same goal. But I totally agree on the goal for this is definitely to use some sort of immutable image that we can distribute and let people pick whatever they want.
So also hi, I'm Vince, also from Heptio. We kind of have been doing this in the VMware, the AWS provider implementation. We kind of took pieces of Boardroom and we created mutable images and then only rely on Bash and kubeadm to pretty much spin up the cluster. Everything else will be baked inside the image. So that we have done it and has been working quite fine across distros. So it's also extendable.
Okay. I think we'll take a look at Boardroom, and I'm kind of glad that you guys are now part of VMware because we can just use your product then. So we're kind of running out of time. I want to move off of this survey unless there's any more last minute questions. I want to demo. I recorded 2 demos last week, and unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to show it at KubeCon. But I want to go ahead and show it today to show what exactly does a cluster API vSphere provider looks like. So if there's no other questions related or comments related to the survey, I want to go ahead and move on. Okay, so the first video, and I'm going to turn the volume up. I'm just going to talk through this. This first part is about building and deploying the OVA. So what you see here, and this was a pre-recorded, so I'm just going to have to fast forward it manually. What you see here is our repo, the vSphere provider repo, and you see here in this, there's a folder down here. There's a folder down here that is named installer, and that is where we do our OVA building. So if we fast forward, and then, so here I am in the repo folder from a terminal, and then I'm going to go into the installer folder. So once you're in the installer folder, you will see that there is a build folder here. And inside of the build folder, we have a script that then you can then call. And if you give it the right parameter, it will build the OVA for you. And the way that our build process builds the OVA, we don't use any external software like Packer. A lot of this technology came from our previous internal projects that we did. So we actually build the OVA from scratch, and we build it inside of Docker. So the only thing that you actually need on your desktop is Docker, and it will build the OVA. So instead of showing you the build process, which takes about 6 minutes, instead I show you that I had already previously built an OVA here. This was built like right before we went to KubeCon. And so here, the first thing I'm going to do, in this video, I'm showing how to deploy the OVA. So the next, we've built the OVA now. And the next step is to deploy the OVA. And there's many ways to do it. You could use the vSphere console. You can use OVF tools. But in this case, we use GoVC. So the first thing that I do is, because I'm using GoVC, I need to modify some input parameters that goes into the OVA deployment. Now, if you're using the vSphere console, when you deploy the OVA, you get a UI screen that you can fill out information. But since we're doing it from the command line here, what I did was I use GoVC, and there's this function import.spec. And what that does is it dumps out an input file, a JSON input file. If we fast forward, and this is what the JSON input file looks like. So here I enter in the root password and the name of the network, and then the root SSH key. I just copied the SSH key, and then so I've put in the SSH key into the JSON file. So there's 3 parameters, and the next thing we do is that we can use GoVC import.ova. We pass in the input file and the name of the data store and the OVA. And what you'll see here, I went to the UI console, and you see that it is uploading and deploying the management cluster. So I'm going to fast forward. So I mentioned in the video that when you deploy this using the vSphere console, the name of the VM that is finally created is cluster-API- some other numbers and alphanumeric numbers. But when you deploy it using Go VC is just, the name is just cluster API. So why don't we just fast forward? Here I mentioned that the other two things that you need to do before, outside of deploying this OVA, is that you have to upload a cloud image and create a VM template. And you also have to create a resource pool inside of vSphere. So this resource pool that we have here up here called kube-resource-pool. And right here we're using a Ubuntu cloud image. And once that is finished uploading, it doesn't automatically power on the VM, although we could do that. So here I'm powering on the VM, and if I click on the image of the VM itself, it brings up the, it shows the status of the VM booting. And once it boots up, it shows this UI. This UI looks, for those of you guys who are familiar with ESX or vSphere, you see this is very familiar. Down here underneath in the blue section, you see Kubernetes cluster status. So we're actually showing the status of what we're doing. So right now we're just pulling the images. And once that's done, it's configuring, and now it's running. So below you will see it says download kubeconfig on your machine. It gives you the instructions on how to download the kubeconfig for that management cluster then that we will then interact with. So here I am copying down the kubeconfig from that management cluster. Now, I just want to point out that there's a lot of steps that you see us doing here, and that's because this is the early days of this OVA, and as we proceed, more of these steps are going to be reduced. We have followed this deployment pattern quite a bit. It's very common in the vSphere community, and we have done this in many projects inside of VMware, not specifically for Kubernetes, but for other projects. And you know, a lot of our customers are mostly VI admin, and they understand this model. So this is something they're very comfortable with. So now we have the kubeconfig right there for that management cluster, and the next thing I do is I just here I get a list of all the pods on that cluster. So that is all there is for this demo. And I just want to go ahead and move on to the next demo. So what have we done in this first demo? Okay, the first demo we showed that the installer, everything, all the bits for the installer is in the main repo. The build process only requires Docker. And then I demonstrated the deployment of the OVA using Go VC and the retrieval of the kubeconfig. Okay, so next I'll bring up the video for the next one. Try to do this as fast as I can. Okay, so in this is also a pre-recorded video. All of the code for these two demos were done on, existed in the repo as of Friday of last week. We haven't done any changes.
Hello everyone, my name is Flo.
Okay, I forgot, turn volume off. Okay, so we have now deployed the OVA. We have pulled the kubeconfig. So the next step I show is that we're going to create oops. See, what am I doing here? Okay, So what I showed was that we have a couple of make targets, and one of the make targets is to create the base YAML files. So what I'm doing is I'm creating the base YAML file from the top level folder in the repo. And that creates an out folder in the top level repo. And here I am showing some of the YAML files. I'm going to just fast forward through this because I think a lot of people here are familiar with it, unless I'll just talk briefly through it. Okay, the first one is the provider components. And this contains all of the CRD for the cluster API system and all of the service account information, etc., that you need to install cluster API. So the first thing that we did was that the first thing that we did previously, is I went ahead and deployed cluster API to our management cluster. Now I'm doing this very manually. I'm not using cluster CTL at this point. So I just deployed the cluster API system to our management cluster. Now this can be done in the future automatically from the OVA, but right now that's not done, and I did it manually here. So now the management cluster has cluster API and is ready to go. So the next thing I show is cluster.yaml. This contains, I think I'm just going to go fast forward because a lot of this is pretty self-explanatory. This contains information about your network for the cluster and also the provider spec for your vSphere environment. And then I show machines.yaml, and this contains information about the machines that you want to create. And in here, under provider spec, under machine spec, these are all vSphere specific parameters. Okay. So, okay. So here I am copying the kubeconfig that we had gotten from the management cluster from before to this folder. And here I think okay. So in this okay, so I'm just okay. I just used the kubeconfig to make sure that that we can still access the management cluster. So I go out, and the next thing I do is I build a copy of the cluster CTL CLI. Now remember, in the presentation that Chris and I did, the cluster CTL right now is you have to build it in every provider repo, and the reason is that it relies on some logic within each provider repo to do its thing. So most of the cluster CTL code is in the upper level cluster API repo, but there's still some code that relies on some internal provider specific logic. So we build a copy of cluster CTL. Okay. Next thing we do is that we're going to create a cluster using that command, cluster CTL. And notice that I pass in -e, and then I give it the management cluster kubeconfig. And then I go ahead and start running it. And if we look here, we see that it is creating the master. So I'm gonna fast forward. Fast forward again. Fast forward some. Okay, so here we see that it's completed, and you'll see the message that you can now access your cluster with kubectl -kubectl-kubectl-kubectl. So what this says is that cluster CTL, after it created the cluster, the master on the management, on the target cluster, I'm sorry, using the management cluster, it pulled down the kubeconfig from the target cluster. Now, if you recall from the sessions at KubeCon, the target cluster is the cluster that you actually want to create. And so this is, we're using the management cluster to create target cluster. And now that we have a target cluster with one master, it automatically pulled down the kubeconfig for that, for the target cluster. So I fast forward, and you can see right here in that folder, we have the cluster API.kubeconfig, that's the management cluster kubeconfig, and kubeconfig, that's the target cluster kubeconfig. Now, like I said before, with there are a lot of steps here. We're going to keep working on this and make it a lot simpler. But for now, one of the comments from our survey is that users want to be able to do all this from a web UI and not use command line. And I think that's a direction that we're going to head into. So now when I look at the target cluster, we see the master there. And let me fast forward. So here, the next thing that we're going to do is I create a machine set. This is a machine set YAML. And this is like a replica set. It's basically n copy of a homogeneous machine definition. So you have one machine definition that you were going to replicate multiple times. Here I go directly to the target cluster. I say, and then I go ahead and create the machine set. Go ahead and fast forward. Okay, so here we're going to just keep monitoring this until the machines come up. Okay, and then our machine starts coming up now, and it takes a while for it to come up. Okay, and eventually comes up, and I just skipped through all that just because of given time. So that was the demo that I recorded this on during not this recent Sunday, but the Sunday previously, hoping that we would have time to show it at the KubeCon session, but we just didn't have enough time. Any comments or questions on any of that? And like I said, everything do with our repo, including our installer, our CI, it's all in the repo. We keep everything in GitHub in that repo. So.
This was just super useful. Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, agreed. And what is the mechanism that you're using to join the clusters? Is it kubeADM currently?
Currently, it's kubeADM. Yes.
And then is that just being orchestrated like from a script or through SSH, or how does that happen?
Both through a script. Yeah, it's all done through a script. The only thing that we use SSH for inside of cluster CTL right now is to pull out the kubeconfig.
Okay, and that like join logic script is, I don't know, something like rc.local or something like that?
I don't know at the top of my head. Siddharth, are you there?
Yes.
You want to you answer that question?
Sure. So that actually is parsed in as a CloudNet user script. It's basically run as the CloudNet process as part of the user data script execution.
Okay, so just a bash script inside of user data?
Yes.
Okay, I posted a link to a CloudNet provider that I had written for kubeADM that uses, like it's basically integrated with CloudNet. The nice thing about that is that if users want additional parameters, like the problem with a user data script is it's kind of like all or none, right? You take the bash and it kind of works. But if you're using straight Cloud Init, you can have other parameters in there like SSH keys or users, et cetera, and they won't be trounced on, but because they have separate namespaces within the user data file.
Okay, can you? Is this the link that you provided in chat?
Yeah, it's a link in chat. I wrote it a while ago, and I have not contributed it up to. CloudNet's actually owned by Canonical, and you need to have Bazaar and all that stuff, and I didn't have the patience for that. But we can go. I've used this, and I've gone off and built actual CloudNet RPMs and debs, and just inject them into the image that I use, and it does work. So, might be worth considering.
Okay, we will take a look at that.
Yeah, and about the CloudNet data source, actually, so we are using indeed another CloudNet data source custom built for vSphere. So that was one of the things that Andrew from VMware, I mean, he wrote the CloudNet provider, and this specifically uses like the vSphere properties, so like VMX properties, to basically get the data. And that's what is, I mean, there are two choices actually today. I mean, if you go with the default Ubuntu cloud image, then in that image we use the OVF properties to pass in the CloudNet data. And there is another option which you can actually specify in the spec if your image happens to have that particular special CloudNet provider in it, install in it, which is a vSphere one. And if you specify that property to be true, then we actually, when we create an instance, we actually use those special properties, which are essentially your VMX properties, to pass in the information. So it's slightly different mechanism, but I guess maybe it might be worthwhile looking into, I mean, the cloud provider that you wrote alongside with the cloud provider that was written in general for VMware platform that we are using right now. And there might be some synergy in terms of how we can maybe have either both of them if it makes it easier to operate the cluster.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if it's just a fork of the CloudNet upstream or if it's written something else like, I don't know, C or Go or whatever. I just did it in the Python that comes from CloudNet because I want it to be integrated with them. But I mean, I think the logic would.
That's actually. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I think Andrew did. I mean, he just implemented like a reference implementation of how anybody would write a CloudNet plugin, like a CloudNet provider, and he just used that and created a Python-based script. So. Okay.
Thanks, Craig. We will take a look at your project, the link that you provided. We're running out of time very quickly. We only have 8 minutes left. I just want to talk a little bit about so given that we're in the middle of December now, and I think a lot of us are going to start taking off for holiday break. I just want to talk about what the community can expect from us going into the end of the year. And from my point of view, since I'm only going to be here for another week, my focus for this week is mostly just to work with Hui and adding more periodic testing into CI, so we can do more end-to-end testing as periodics into the vSphere provider repo. If anybody else wants to talk about what they're planning to work on to try to finish up the rest of the year, go ahead. Fabio, it would be nice to know if we can get the ESX.
Can I just interject 1 second?
Okay.
I was looking at the calendar since you mentioned that pretty much everybody's going to be, on vacation in some form or another. I mean, the next meeting is supposed to happen on New Year's Eve. Definitely a no for me.
Yeah, definitely a no for me too.
Also because it's almost midnight here, so it will be like between New Year's Eve and New Year's. So no. I think we're gonna safely cancel the next meeting and just resume on January 7th, right?
How about we can do it on January 7th, or just postpone it to January 14th, because there's not going to be very much activity. I won't be here on the.
I'm sorry, you're right. You're right. Yes, January 14th. Yes, because it's supposed to be on January 14th. Yes, just cancel the next one and that's it.
Okay. Fabio, do you want to talk about whether we can get ESX provisioning? So let me just, for those are new people here today, to use Cluster API on vSphere, you need to have a vCenter cluster. We have been working on provisioning a cluster on just plain ESX. The biggest roadblock for us is the VM template functionality. That functionality is not readily available on ESX, and Fabio has been working on that. What do you say, Fabio?
Let me just say that so the functionality is there and the PR is already open. It's a work in progress. The problem with the PR is that it's been sitting there for, I guess, about a month, and in the meantime there were a lot of changes happening in the repo, so there will be possibly a lot of changes that I have to pour my patches to. So hopefully, I'm definitely going to work on it. I'm not going to promise anything for it this week, because as everybody, I'm basically trying to finish up on everything before going to the holiday break. I'll try to, for sure. In the meantime, if there's anyone that wants to test, because I had some problems in provisioning, like I had some environmental problems with my environment with ESX. For some reason, my ESX will sometimes successfully deploy the cluster. Sometimes it would just fail with some weird errors, and even like trying to reproduce that on like using a Vagrant box built with ESX Vagrant box, it would just yield to some strange errors, or sometimes it will work, sometimes it would not work for no reason, for apparent no reason. So I'm trying to get more people to actually test the PR. So obviously the PR must be checked out at the time that the PR was created. So I'm not even sure if it's in working condition right now, because it might check out some code that is no longer there in repos that are outside the cluster API provider vSphere. So I'll if somebody wants to try it out, just feel free and hit me up on Slack if you see any roadblock. I'll try to work on it before the end of the week. But I'm not promising anything. Sorry.
I have a stupid question. How does ESX relate to vSphere, or if it doesn't?
So the idea basically is that you have a number of ESX hosts. So ESX is the hypervisor. So ESX is essentially the operating system that is installed on a physical machine. And you have multiple ESX hosts, and multiple ESX hosts are managed by a vCenter. So basically, vCenter is a control plane for multiple ESX hosts. The API is the same, so you can point things like GoVC or any API client to both ESX and vCenter, and it will work seamlessly, because the API is essentially the same. The difference here is the API surface of ESX is smaller than the API surface of vCenter. So there's a lot of more facilities on vCenter that you cannot use when you're dealing with a single ESX host. So things like you cannot clone a VM, you cannot have a template. There's some limitations on the API, but the API is the same. So right now we're trying to basically come up with alternative solutions to mimic the same functionality that we have on vCenter on plain ESX, namely cloning a VM, having some sort of template in the VM, like having a VM that is powered off that serves as a template, and so on. So that's pretty much what we're doing.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. We only have 1 minute left. Doug, do you want to talk about a little bit more about your schedule and whether you can do more on the vSphere side of testing before the end of the year, or should we not assume very much more work is going to be done on that part? Doug, are you still there? Okay, Doug is, oh, Doug is there. Doug, you're, okay.
Not paying attention.
Maybe he's having computer problems, or he might not be there. Okay, so Doug has been working on doing functional testing and beefing up vSphere so that we can actually simulate running a cluster on using vSphere. And so far we have the first, we had the first PR about a month ago, or maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, to test out the machine actuator create a workflow. And this work is going to continue on. It's going to continue on into next quarter. There's a lot of interesting work that we thought about adding to vSphere. Like right now vSphere can simulate a vSphere environment, but part of cluster API, the workflow is that you have to deploy a cluster. And how can you verify? How can you simulate a cluster in the status that it provides back that was created? So that's some of the really interesting work that's going to go into vSphere into next year. So yeah, thanks everyone. I don't think that we have any other topics, and I guess we'll meet back on January 14th. Hopefully, some of the other past companies that have joined this meeting will come back next year. And if there's nothing else, I think we can call an end to this meeting. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Once the video has been uploaded, I will provide a link to the video on this meeting notes. I'll see you guys next year. Bye.
Bye, folks.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.